Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live today. We have a great show lined up for you, and we are so glad to have you all in the audience. We have a few things going on at MyHeritage that I'm going to let you know about before we start today. So a lot of exciting things happening here at MyHeritage to tell you about. The first one is a promotion that we have going on now, free death records at MyHeritage. So this began yesterday, and it is in celebration of Halloween, which is happening on the 31st. So we are offering free access to all death records at MyHeritage. All death records that were added before October to MyHeritage are available for free, and you can access that by going to myheritage.com/death-records, and I'll put that link in the comments section. So that's very exciting. Lots of records available for you to search for free. It's millions and millions of records, and we're so glad to be able to offer you that for Halloween. So that's great news for everyone. And we'll put a link in the comment section so you could take advantage of that amazing promotion that we have going on. And besides for that, we also have a DNA sale happening at MyHeritage in honor of Halloween as well. An amazing sale on MyHeritage DNA kits. As we all know, it's now the end of October, so it's a great time to start stocking up on DNA gifts for friends and family for the holiday season. No time like the present. So we'll put a link to that sale in the comment section as well. And it's a great way to make sure that everything arrives in time for the holidays. Start early, and that way you know for sure it gets there on time. So we'll put a link to the free death records that we're offering until November 2nd, and also the MyHeritage DNA kit sale for you to take a look at. In light of those free records that we're offering now, we have an amazing session lined up for you today by James Tanner about researching death and burial records. And there'll be a look at MyHeritage records. So we're really excited about that. And just before I introduce James into the Facebook Live, we'll be offering a giveaway for today. So we're really excited to be able to give away a MyHeritage complete plan to one lucky winner in our audience. And to enter, all that you have to do is leave us a comment in the comment section and let us know what you have found researching death, burial, cemetery records, any of the above. What you found, was it, did you visit a gravestone and you found out new information about an ancestor that you didn't know about? Anything like that, just let us know in the comment section. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And as always, leave any questions that you have in the comments. We answer questions at the end of each show, and we hope to be able to get to as many of them as possible. So feel free to leave comments, questions. We always read what all of our viewers write there in the comments section. And I would always like to point out before we start that this Facebook Live, as well as all of our Facebook Lives, are available for viewing at the MyHeritage Facebook page under the videos section. So you can go check out tons of great materials on DNA, family history, genealogy from experts around the world. And today's session is no exception. It will be available there as well after today's show. So let me bring James on to say hello to us today. Here we go. Let's get him into the picture. Hello, James. How are you?
Howdy. How are you doing today?
Great. So James is joining us from Utah.
Yep. It's just nice fall weather here. Getting a little bit cooler.
Yeah, a little bit. Are you feeling the seasons changing a little?
Oh yeah, we've got a lot of snow on our mountains right behind us, and we're hoping there's a good ski season this year.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. So we're really looking forward to this session. It's great timing because of this free record collection that we're offering for Halloween. So we're really excited to learn more about death and burial records. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's wonderful to be here.
Amazing. So should I bring up your slides?
Yep. Ready to go anytime.
Great. Let's get them into the screen. Okay, there we go. We should see them now.
Okay. Well, here we go. One of the things that I think is a hallmark of genealogists is that eventually, as you get involved in searching out your ancestors, you find out that it's a good idea to visit cemeteries. And it's probably quite a few of us, but may seem strange to those who are not involved in their families that much, that we spend considerable time traveling to, searching out and walking through, and in many cases, photographing headstones. And I know one thing that's happened in the past is that MyHeritage is very much dedicated to preserving the information that is contained on headstones, because they had a project a short time ago to digitize all of the headstones in in Israel. And that was a bad mistake, in Israel, and make sure that they were transcribed. And so Israel is essentially the first country in the world that has all of their headstones indexed, transcribed, and available to be searched. So it's there are wonderful opportunities to learn about family members as you visit the old hometown cemeteries where many of the people were buried. So let's get along and get moving. The earliest death and burial records date back thousands of years. This is one of the major things that are preserved. If we think of, for example, and the reason I said Egypt is with the Egyptian pyramids. The pyramids are basically a death and burial record, if you want to look at it from a genealogical standpoint. Wasn't a lot of information, but when they examined the contents of the pyramids, they were able to find out a lot of information about the people who built the pyramids and how they lived and what they were. So basically, those kinds of things are part of the resources, looking in a wider sense of what we have. And it's surprising. I have a relative who is buried in a small town in eastern Arizona here in the United States, and a very small town. Hardly anyone would have recognized the name. And printed on the back of her grave marker is a 4-generation genealogy chart. So there's some things sometimes very surprising information that can be obtained by visiting a cemetery. Finding the death and burial records begins with locating the place where the person died. That's kind of obvious. In our day and age, just because a person dies in a certain location does not mean necessarily that they're going to be buried there, because many people choose to be buried back in some kind of a family cemetery area or in their original town. I have a neighbor whose wife died not too long ago, and well, actually quite a few years ago. And when you get old like me, believe me, not a couple of years is not a long time ago. But basically, she was buried not in Utah, but in California. And when he died very recently, a very good friend of mine, he was also wanted to be buried with his wife. So if you were starting to look for the place where they died as opposed to the place where they were buried, that would not be very helpful. So it can turn into a sort of a search, a mystery as to why there's no grave, or perhaps there are other reasons for that beyond the fact that there's not a grave marker readily available in a cemetery near where they died. Not to mention, of course, I haven't mentioned the fact that there could be many unmarked graves, and unmarked graves all over the countries of the world where people have died and not been buried for some reason or another. Many English churches began keeping their individual records beginning in 1538. This was an interesting situation in England. Henry VIII broke off from the Catholic Church and began his basically what we call the Church of England. In America, we call it the Episcopal Church. And they and immediately began asking or directing that the parishes, each of the separate church divisions called parishes, were required to keep birth, marriage, and death information in the form of burial information. Now, this wasn't uniformly started in 1538, but it spread and eventually was made mandatory. And so there are a tremendous number of records available in England that show birth, marriages, and burials. And the burials are helpful because they are actual burials, not records of where the person died. And so you will find information about the individuals who are buried in the specific church cemeteries through those records. And it's interesting to follow through on visiting and looking at cemeteries. We lived in Maryland, an eastern part of the United States, for a year while we were digitizing records in the Maryland State Archives. And because of that, we became acquainted with one of the local people in the area who was part of the Anne Arundel County Genealogical Society and had basically organized an effort to locate every single burial in this Anne Arundel County, and there were hundreds and hundreds of different places that people were buried, and so it can be a tremendous benefit when we have that. But we have the knowledge that knowing that there's probably a lot of burial sites out there that we haven't located and aren't aware of is also part of what we do as genealogists and trying to locate those. Now, this is just one example of the time frame and the records that might be available. In different countries, the records are kept in different ways. Sometimes they're only local in the parish. Sometimes they're kept by a governmental subdivision, either a province or county or some other district of the country. But it's up to the genealogical researchers to take some time and find those records. Here's another example of records that were kept. And this is a different place. There's no specific burial records as such, other than some cemetery records that exist in New England. But these death records were part of the burial information that goes clear back into the 1600s in New England town records. So going through and finding a death record in a New England town record requires reading through the page by page, the town records. I have found very, very few of the town records indexed. However, there are some indexed records out there. So you can, there are different ways to approach your effort to find a burial. So you can use what I was just talking about worldwide. In other words, just because I mention England or New England, those places are not unique. Around the world, there are other different burial practices. There are countries, of course, where cremation is a primary, and death records will become more important than any kind of a burial record. So it's depends on the location, depends on the circumstances in a particular country, but it's always profitable for genealogical research to investigate cemeteries if they exist and when they are available. Um, in the United States, it's important to understand that there are records that can help locate a grave even if there are no grave marker, even if there's nothing that really marks the location of a cemetery or a burial ground. So basically, these records come in the form of a variety of different kinds of records. One of the kinds of records is that United States topographical maps, historically over time during the last couple of hundred years when topographical maps have been made, have used marking burial sites or cemeteries as part of the topographical maps. And many of these cemeteries that are available on the United States government topographical map resources are available. They're all available, as a matter of fact, from the United States government on the websites. There's a specific website for topographical maps. In the United States, there's also other kinds of places where records are created. What happens in the United States and some countries, maybe not all, cemeteries have, in a sense, been privatized in that people can actually go into the business of creating a cemetery and charging money to sell burial plots, and not only making money off the burial plots, but also charging fees for burials and headstones and things like that. And so it's a business, and it has been going on for many, many years in the United States and I assume in other places. But the burial records take two forms. One is the set of records that document the ownership of the burial plots. And these in the United States are recorded. They're actually recorded with land and property records. So you can search burial plots in any particular state in the United States through the county records in each state and the county's recorder. Then they will have someone in this county who is in charge of that, and they will have been regulating and selling burial plots. And then there are interment registers documenting the burials, and these are generally kept within the cemetery. They may also be, and the person in charge of that in English is called a sexton. And the person, and sometimes they have, if they're part of a community burial, community cemetery, then they may also have a city person. Part of their job is overseeing the cemetery, usually someone who has to do with maintenance and land and the property that is owned by the city. And in this case, the interment records will have all of the information about the location of the various burial plots and the people who own those plots or are buried in those plots. Now, what's happening more recently in the United States, and I assume in some other countries, is that burial plots are becoming very, very expensive because the area that is available for cemeteries is limited, especially in cities where that are landlocked. In other words, people where the cities can no longer acquire adjoining property to their town boundaries. So in those cases, it's interesting here because some burial plots are only allowing people to be buried as long as a fee is paid by the descendants, the people concerned, and other people are buried in the same plot. If they don't continue to pay the fee, then I guess they don't dig it up and throw it away. But we've understand that they're burying people even one and two, and I mean 2 and 3 deep on various plots. So there's different ways that are happening, and this all makes it more complicated for genealogical researchers. Now, it's important to understand that sometimes we focus now, as I've mentioned now considerably, uh, burial and cemetery records and death records. But I think that going through the process here in the United States may be illustrative of how this might be handled in many different countries around the world. And the first thing that happens in the United States if someone dies, unless they're dying out in the wilderness and not discovered, something like that, there's usually in the last approximately 100 years, there have been some places that created a death certificate. Now, the trap you get into in the United States is that death certificates per se, a document created by the state in the United States to record deaths was not generally done until in all states until the mid 1900s, and it's some 1960 or some of the latest places, some of the states that adopted uniform records. And so when people say, well, just go look for a death certificate, yeah, well, that's just fine if they died within the last 100 years or so. But if they died further back in the United States past 100 years, you have to rely on other death records because death certificates were just simply not done, were not available or made. There was nobody who recorded the death of an individual and or reported it to any kind of a government agency. So that's when these death markers, grave markers and the death records that are kept by other entities such as churches or newspapers or other records that you can rely on become very important. So the formal process can involve even further than a medical certificate of death. A person who dies may have to go through a medical examination or be handled by a coroner, depending on where they die and how they die and the circumstances. There also may be what's called an inquest, and that is a formal government inquiry into the circumstances of the death and to determine whether there was some reason to look further to foul play or criminal activity in the death. Generally speaking, the inquests were routine matters, but sometimes became extremely complicated. So one of those other areas are records of medical examiners, the coroner records, and the inquest records, if they're being held, and if that was something that resulted as a result of the burial. These records are not the same as the death records that are generally available when you do research online. They are usually still kept in various formats and may not even be really readily available to the public. The second level is where a person is, where the burials were handled by a third party, someone who is in the business of burying people and preparing the bodies for burial. In the United States, they're called funeral directors, morticians, and there are other common names for all of these people around the world who are in that position. And interestingly enough, the funeral director and the funeral directors are the ones who carry the burden of keeping the records about their particular business. And in the case, for example, one of my friends is a funeral director and owns a number of funeral homes in Arizona. And he, on a questioning that I did ask him about his records, he had records going back into the 1800s of deaths and burials throughout Arizona and the different places, and in fact, in adjoining states. So these can be very valuable, and it's interesting to note that these records are maintained by the funeral. I mentioned an inquest, and this is only some places require an inquest regardless of the conditions of death. In other cases, it's only as if there's a suspicious or unknown cause of death. And then I mentioned the cemetery sextons. And in some cases, there is an office on the cemetery property. These are larger or more established cemeteries, and usually in larger communities. It's not common for smaller communities to have any kind of actual building or office on the cemetery itself. But in larger cities, it's very, very common. And these people have the records for all of the ownership and all of the business done by the cemetery. And so they're very valuable. And sometimes it's, in my experience, extremely interesting to talk to these people because they're not actually very cooperative. That's not the business. They're not in the business of helping us find the burials. They're in the business of selling and making money off the burials. So we're not, we're kind of incidental and sometimes not well received as we would hope to be. And I just have to emphasize that all of these different people may have different names and different responsibilities in different countries. And in the past, the names change. So you may or may not see the same names on all of these different entities, but they do perform these levels of involvement and may have created records which can be searched. Some mortuaries or funeral homes stay in business, as I mentioned from my friend in Arizona, really long times. And I often tell people as they're doing research to basically contact them. If you think your ancestor died in that town and you can't find any records online and you don't find anything, and it may have been earlier than first death certificates were kept, then have the person look. I say, go call them at a mortuary. Get online, look up the town, put in funeral homes, mortuary, whatever, and find out all the mortuaries and call them. See how long they've been in business and whether they have records that go back to the date that you're looking for. And if they do, they may very well have been the business that handled those particular burial. So this is just one other way of coming up with the information. And with our global community now, it is not impossible for people in one country to contact funeral homes in another country. So we can get online and find a funeral home in another country, even halfway around the world, and still have opportunity to make an inquiry. And there may be, possibly it happens many times, that people are very cooperative and help to provide records. And important to understand that the mortuary or funeral home may also have a record of an unmarked grave. The reason the grave is unmarked in a cemetery is because the survivors, the descendants, did not pay for the erection of a grave marker. And if a temporary grave marker was installed, it may be long gone, a wooden cross or something similar. So it's just something that you have to be aware of, that you can wait, even if going into the cemetery does not particularly produce the record, you may want to follow up with those people who would have dealt with the death at the time, the church or the community, and find out the time frame for the cemeteries and find out if there are additional records, which I have found, by the way, in abundance in an office, in a city office, in the city office building. In some places, and kind of universally across the United States, if you've been through this burial process, you're aware of it, but you may not be aware of it as a genealogically valuable record, is that there may also be a permit for opening and closing the graves. This is a copy of a permit for burial and a permit for the grave, both two different kinds of documents that were created, both of which have the name of the deceased and the exact location of the grave, even if there wasn't a marker purchased. In addition to that, it has more information about the age of the person who died, and this was a 3-year-old girl, and she died of diphtheria back in 1933. This was part of a set of records that I was able to participate in digitizing for FamilySearch.org. And it was a long process. It took about 3.5 years, but I digitized all of these records going back into the 1800s, and they are now on the Mesa City Cemetery and in other cemeteries in that area. Not all of them they were all buried in the Mesa Cemetery, but they died in various locations and were buried in the Mesa City Cemetery. And so these are valuable records that are available on Family Search. So there's just a lot of information out there that would be surprising and not well known. And as kind of a plea for genealogists out there, if you are out and interested and you're visiting cemeteries and talking to the sextons, always ask if they have records. And then the second question that should always follow is, and are they digitized, and are they preserved, and are they available? So this is something that that's how I started. Basically, went into the cemetery office, saw that there were old records that were in a cabinet in a book, and I said, "Oh, those are really old. Are those what are those burial records?" Yes. And have they been digitized? No. And are you interested in getting them digitized? And there was a very positive response, but it did take 3.5 years to get that job done. So it was not as simple as all that, but it did end up in getting the records digitized. And emphasize this, that it has the location of the grave, even if there's no grave marker. Now, what some of my family members and we have been involved in directly is marking those unmarked graves. And so we have, as families, organized to raise funds to buy a grave marker, a formal grave marker, and had it placed on the grave in the cemetery where it was unmarked previously. And this is a very helpful activity for those who are involved. Now, if the body is transported across state lines in the United States, there's likely a permit. And I assume that internationally, there are lots of documents that are created if a person's body has to be transported across state lines. And those records are available. They're difficult to find because they're not particularly kept in any place. Where I have come across them is in the actual burial records in the cemetery, and they're sometimes included as part of those burial records because the record for transportation and the arrangements for the transportation and burial in another place other than the place where the person died created some paperwork that was preserved. There's no particular reason why it would be, because it's a company, But bear in mind that the people who transport the bodies are often the mortuaries or funeral homes that have arranged for the preparation of the body for burial, and also for the sale of the casket and other items. So this is and the funerals in many cases. So this is can be part of it, but there may be additional records. And if you keep asking questions, you may find that they died in one town, and then when you talk to the funeral home, they may already know where they were buried in another state. So that is a way to get through to that information. Now, important to also understand that MyHeritage has some very large cemetery database collections. It's important to understand that this is one major place to go to get those records. Primary in these is the BillionGraves website. BillionGraves is a separate organization, but it's a partner with MyHeritage. And MyHeritage has an index to the burial, cemetery, and obituary records. Now, BillionGraves is one of the two large online cemetery databases. The other one is Find a Grave. Find a Grave happens to be owned by Ancestry.com. BillionGraves is, as far as I know, currently not owned by MyHeritage. It's owned by a consortium of cemetery companies that operate gravestone marking companies and cemeteries. But BillionGraves has an added value, and that is when you take a picture with BillionGraves with a smartphone or a tablet that has a connection to the internet, the image, the geographic coordinates for the image are recorded right there with the image. So you know exactly where that burial is. And the interesting thing about using BillionGraves is many of my relatives here in Utah were buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery up in Salt Lake County, about 45 miles north of us here. And the Salt Lake City Cemetery is not probably the biggest cemetery in the world, but it is very large, and there are very many thousands of people buried there. It is also very confusing because roads go all different directions, and there are names that looks like a small city, and it's very difficult sometimes to find a grave. But what happens is that with BillionGraves, you can open up the app on your smartphone, and it will not only mark the location of the grave on a map, but it will also show you where you are. And you can walk around for a few minutes, and you can see yourself move, and you walk right directly to the grave, and then you are on top of the little dot for the grave, and you know where you are. And you look down, and there's the grave marker. So it becomes a tremendous help in navigating in these, and also in finding the cemeteries initially because of the GPS coordinates. So there's some really interesting things, and this website is growing continually in all parts of the world. It is a marvelous website in addition, but it's included here. Now you'll see also that there are many other collections of cemeteries as well as other death records on large databases of death records on MyHeritage. So this offer that MyHeritage has made in the same time as this broadcast is being made to offer free access is really something that's worth looking at. I mentioned a moment ago about an individual in Anne Arundel County who did a survey of all of the cemetery inscriptions and transcriptions and published them actually in a series of 3 books. But another thing that happens is that I, early on, essentially when computers were very new, participated in a survey of the Mesa, Arizona survey, even before the other records that I did, long before, in cataloging every one of the grave markers and putting them in a book. And that book was donated to the Mesa Family Search Library, which is no longer in existence and now is in the Salt Lake City Family Search Library, in the big library in Salt Lake. So basically, you can look in books, and I have used many books to find this information. I also mentioned about the topographical maps, and if you were thinking, well, why didn't he give us a notice of where they are? Well, here they are. It's under the USGS Historical Topographical Maps collection. And the United States Geological Survey has been digitizing records for many, many years, and they have a very unique collection. The maps have a map viewer that's very sophisticated, and you can load in various years of topographical maps for the same location, and then use the program to overlay to see differences or what's been marked newly or where old things were. It's just a very interesting website to use. Unfortunately, the usgs.gov or usgs.gov in a website is like many federal government websites in the United States, very large and very difficult to navigate. So it's easier just to go into Google and do a search for topographical maps. And if you want to throw in USGS, it might help to get right there. But if you start out with usgs.gov, I don't know how I would do it, but there may be. It changes so frequently that I really have no idea, but I find it to be very difficult to get down to some of these resources. So here's an example of the Topo view maps from beginning from 1884 to 2006. And you can look at these maps, and if you look here carefully, you could see that there was a marking for the city cemetery out here in Joseph City, Arizona. And you may not be able to spot it initially unless you're used to looking at topographical maps. But if I blow it up a bit, you'll probably be able to see it right there. There's exactly the location of the cemetery. And even though this is an older map, the highway is still there, although now it's a freeway. And you can get off the freeway and navigate and find this exact location on the topographical map. The city isn't much bigger than it was back then, and so there's no problem with it now being in the middle of a subdivision. Once you've got that location, however, there's another step that you can take, and that is you can use Google Maps to look at the actual location. So I can zoom in, and here is that same map that was shown on the topographical maps from an aerial view. And you can even see the tops of the grave markers there. You can see it's not exactly in one of the better parts of the town. Well, it's really just sort of out on the hill in the desert. And one other way to do this is to look up a location and then ask Google Maps to mark the location of all the cemeteries. And then if you find the cemetery you're looking for, you can use that as the mark to how to get there. And it will show, in this case, showing how I would drive from my home in Provo down to Joseph City, right directly to the cemetery. And it tells me how long it would take by automobile. Obviously, I'm not going to walk. Here's a little bit clearer picture of that on just a regular map. So one other advantage of using Google for this purpose is once you're there in the United States and many other places around the world, with some notable exceptions, there you can go down and use what's called Google Street View, and that will put you close to the location. And actually, in this case, you can see the entrance to the cemetery, which is literally out on the Colorado Plateau Plains, high desert of northern Arizona. This is an example of another type of finding aid. This is from a way that we use to find the old Tanner Cemetery. And the Rhode Island Historical Cemetery Commission actually was a government agency that went out and searched and found as many of all of the historical cemeteries, those that were marked and unmarked, that they could find, and they published all of that. And now they have that online in a cemetery database. Now you can look for this in the United States and in other countries and other states and places where local people, a state or province or district, have put up a database of the cemeteries. And here's a copy of the map when you begin to look. This is the Rhode Island on the east coast of the United States, and that's a map showing all the cemeteries that have been located in their current locations. Kind of interesting. And then there's another way to search, and that is through the database, and I can look up the names of the people. And so I have here the names of various Tanner people who are buried in that in the same location, well, somewhere in Rhode Island that they have. And there's a long list. You'll see it goes through pages and pages of Tanners, where all my particular line, family, Tanner line. There are other Tanner families that were unrelated, where coming from North. And here was a drawing of the original cemetery and a description of how you get to that cemetery and where it is and what was there located back some time ago. And then giving the actual geographic coordinates. And then when you go to the Google Maps, you can use those coordinates to go right exactly to the cemetery, which is what we did. Quite a story there, which is much longer than I can tell in a broadcast, but it's very interesting how you use that information to find the exact cemetery. On the other hand, you could just use BillionGraves or MyHeritage and find the same information today. It's there. So it's just interesting that I could have had a shortcut. This was a number of years ago that I was looking for the cemetery, but now it would be much simpler. One thing that's important that you do is that you learn about cemetery etiquette. There is really an etiquette about cemeteries, and one of the major ones is never do harm to the grave markers. There's enough problems with weathering and the normal processes of aging that happens to the materials that are used for grave markers without people unintentionally or intentionally defacing or trying to clean and thereby destroying the information that's available. Because many cleansers, many times the things that you think would just really clean that up really well are harmful to the stones and may in fact hasten the demise of the markers. As you go through a cemetery, you may find markers that have fallen over. You may find markers that are unreadable. And in many cases, like the Tanner Cemetery that I just showed a moment ago, there's nothing left. It's just a rock. And it's only because someone in the past made the discovery and found the location and recorded at least the information that was available at that time, that the information was preserved. So it's important also to check with visiting hours, access, not assuming that you can simply go to a cemetery without asking permission. Many cemeteries are private. In the United States, there are lots of cemeteries that are on private property and not necessarily accessible without someone's permission. So it may take some time to find out where they are and how accessible they are. But once you're there, you need to kind of overcome your interest in improving the cemetery. One thing that was popular years ago, uh, probably still continuing, was called cemetery rubbings, where you would take a piece of paper and usually like a piece of charcoal or a crayon of some kind, some colored thing, and rub it against, hold it against the face of the cemetery marker, and then do a rubbing that would show the information. That is not permitted in some cemeteries, and you need to be aware of that. And also, it could be damaging to the surface of the grave marker. So there's not any there's some things that you really need to be cautious about. In our day and age, the simplest thing to do is to take digital photos and then upload those digital photos to MyHeritage or to BillionGraves or some other website, but upload them so that other people can find and see and gain the information from the cemetery markers. Okay, well, that's about all I have for today, which I suppose sounds like a whole lot.
That was a whole lot and so informative. I love that you added the etiquette in there as well, because that's just so important. And I know that from as you were talking about the project that MyHeritage worked on, digitizing all the cemeteries in Israel. So it's exactly that. That was, that etiquette was just so important as we embarked on that huge project.
Yeah, it was a great project. There are a lot of projects going on now, nationally, locally, genealogical societies. So there, you can find those in your community if you need to. I contacted BillionGraves not too long ago, and I asked them about Utah. I said, "Well, okay, I need a place where I can go out and do take some pictures of cemetery that's not on your website." And they said, "Sorry, everything in Utah's on our website." So I said, "Oh, okay, well, that ends that. I'll have to go someplace else." So.
Wow, incredible! So all of Utah is up. All the cemeteries of Utah are digitized.
Wow. On BillionGraves. So it's interesting.
So you're going to have to go out of state to help out next time.
Oh, well.
So we do have a few questions, James, if that's okay, that we'd like to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. So we'll just take a few before we give away our prize for the day. So we have a question here from, let's see, from Sherry, and she says, my question is, what information is provided and where if an ancestor is buried at sea?
You mean as a criminal? A thief? Usually those are, you would have to go to court records or whatever records are available through the court system. They would not necessarily show the actual burial location because they had what are called paupers graves, graves for people who had no funds, and they were generally unmarked. But the records of the actual burial itself may or may not be available through the court system. So that's kind of where you're going to need to focus, is which court would have he would have been convicted in, or she, and what would happen with the disposal if he died in prison, or if he died in Provo. Here we had a state hospital which was for historically for all kinds of categories of people who today would not be considered people who would need to be kept in a state hospital. When they died, they were buried in unmarked graves, and there was a big project to mark all of those graves. And we now do not have all the graves marked, but there are large monuments in the Provo cemetery showing the names of all those people who were buried in that cemetery.
Okay, we have a question here from Heather. She asks, would funeral director or funeral home records be available to the public?
Maybe. It would depend on the circumstances. In most countries, there are privacy laws, and in the United States, they vary from state to state depending on the circumstances. You're going to find anything from 20 years to 100 years, and so you need, or more, and you need to be cognizant of the fact that you just might not be able to get the records because they're private. The only way you're going to get around that, by the way, is to start showing them you actually are a relative of this person and you need the information. Sometimes that overcomes the need to have the privacy.
Okay, Rivka asks, we find it difficult to get data on burials from Switzerland around 1933. Any suggestions?
We find it difficult to get information from Switzerland about anything. I'm sorry. That's just kind of a known thing with genealogists, is that Switzerland is a place you have to deal with. Basically, you're going to be reduced, ultimately in what happens with people that I know who have relatives directly in Switzerland and that are genealogists and dedicated genealogists, is they pack up and go to Switzerland and do their research because that's about the only way they were able to get to all the records they need.
It's under lock and key over there.
Yeah, the only other place you'd probably find less opportunity would be Iceland, because unless you're actually a citizen of the country, current citizen of Iceland, you don't have access to the genealogy records. So.
Oh wow! So you have to make a local friend, I guess, in Iceland.
Yeah, yeah, you do.
Oh, wow. Okay. We have a question here from Michael, and he asks, how often is the BillionGraves database updated?
Probably every week, as people put in. The BillionGraves is a cooperative website, so people are taking pictures around the world. I have a son-in-law who travels extensively for his work, and one of his, I guess you'd call it a hobby, but it's really more of a passion, is that he, on his off time while he's working, he locates a cemetery and starts taking pictures for BillionGraves. So he is one of the top BillionGraves contributors, and they have people all over the world who are now taking pictures and uploading them directly to BillionGraves and then transcribing the grave markers. Now, I use the term grave marker, and people call them headstones or whatever. There's lots of other terms, but that's the generic term for anything that marks the location of a grave.
Wow, what an amazing way to give back while on a business trip. That's incredible of your son-in-law.
Yeah, we always feel sorry. I was in a very famous place, Oberammergau in Germany. And there's a very nice cemetery there. And I didn't know, I mean, perhaps I was prohibited from doing it, but since I'm obsessive, I decided to look up and see if any of the pictures were online, and they weren't. There was nothing there. So I'm assuming there are really good places to go, and it may take some political maneuvering or some permissions to do it, but you don't want to just take the pictures and put them up. That would not make anybody happy. So,
wow. Let's see, we have a question. Bernice asks, does MyHeritage have a time period regarding access to the death certificates? So just to answer your question, Bernice, the death records on MyHeritage are available for free until the 2nd of November. It's in honor of Halloween. And it's also death records that were added to MyHeritage before October of 2021. So there's a link there in the comment section to a blog post where we talk about the promotion. So just so you know, and anyone who wants to look that up. Jan asks, how do you access BillionGraves for free? So actually this week, you know that all the death records on MyHeritage are available until November 2nd, completely for free. And in general, James, BillionGraves, is there a paid subscription? How does that work?
BillionGraves is a free website. You can go on and do searches for free. There is a registration level, and there is a paid level. The paid level gives you a lot more searching features and additional helps, especially with maps and things like that. So it's depending on the time you're interested, how much time you're going to be spending looking for graves. If you're going to take a trip to go someplace to find graves in another part of your country or another part of the world, be sure and get it all figured out on BillionGraves before you go and exactly where everything is, because that's a great help.
They do say that genealogists like to vacation in cemeteries, so I guess it's true.
Oh, it seems like it's interesting because no matter where we go, my wife and I, we seem to always end up walking through a cemetery someplace. So it's interesting.
And what's the most interesting thing you've ever seen on a headstone? What's the most
the most interesting headstones are in Tombstone, Arizona. And Tombstone was a Wild West town, and it proliferates. It actually publicizes the fact that we're a Wild West place. It's a tourist trap, but they have the old Tombstone Cemetery, and they have all sorts of very, very funny and very interesting. So if you really want to see some interesting headstone markers, look up Tombstone, Arizona Cemetery, and you'll find pictures, thousands of them, hundreds. They're not thousands, but hundreds of pictures.
Wow. Okay, we'll have to go and look that up now. I think all of us are gonna go and take a little look after the Facebook Live and see what interesting things we can dig up over there. Okay, so let's see, Etta said to us, and she just wrote, this is so timely. I'm about to take a trip for genealogy and will be spending most of my time in cemeteries in Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana. So Etta, I guess you'll take a lot of these tips that James has provided today for your trip. And actually, for anyone who wants to learn more, we have another cemetery death record themed Facebook Live on Monday, November 1st. So that's just in a few more days. And it'll be given by Kathy Wallace of BillionGraves. And it'll be about finding your story with BillionGraves. So make sure to tune in to that Facebook Live as well, and we hope to see you all at that one. So now, James, if it's okay, we'll give out one lucky winner. We'll give them a MyHeritage Complete plan.
Okay, let me give you one of the cemetery markers that's famous. It says, "Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a 44, no less, no more."
Wow, and I'm sure there are so many more interesting ones like that.
Yeah, there's just, yeah, there are dozens of them. But remember to put in Arizona, Tombstone, Arizona, because Tombstone's too general. So,
Okay, we'll take a look. We'll take a look.
okay.
So we're so happy to be able to give a MyHeritage complete plan to one lucky winner. And of course, a complete plan is the best plan we have to offer at MyHeritage. It'll give one lucky user unlimited access to over 15 billion historical records. Of course, we're adding more historical records every week here at MyHeritage, as well as unlimited family tree size, advanced DNA tools, as well as unlimited use of the MyHeritage photo tools. So it's an incredible prize. We're very excited to be able to give it away. I'll just read out, I'll read out runners up first before we get to our winner. So let's see, we have first runner up is Valerie, and Valerie wrote to us and said, after leaving the US Army, I ended up finding out about an ancestor who was buried at the US Army base I was stationed at. Well, that's really, that's amazing to find out that they were buried at the same base, Valerie. That's incredible. Our second runner-up is Lorna, and Lorna wrote to us and said, I've discovered that the date of birth on my granddad's headstone is a year off. My family was sent the wrong birth certificate from England for a different boy with the same 3 names, born 13 months apart. Wow, what a revelation to discover that, Lorna. And now our winner. So our winner for today is Robin Swats. And Robin wrote to us and said, my great-grandmother's death certificate had the names of her parents, which helped us find our Sicilian connections and cousins in Louisiana. The names weren't in her obituary or anywhere else that we found. So what an amazing discovery from that death certificate, Robin. And we're glad to hear about that. And we'll be in touch with you through private message to claim your prize. So James, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We really learned so much, and we hope that everyone here in the audience will take advantage of the free death records that we have going on in honor of Halloween this week, available until November 2nd. Take a look at the blog post link, which is in the comments section, and we hope to see you all at the Facebook Live next week. So thank you, James, and have a good day there.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.